Welcome, dear listeners, to another tale from the quiet, deceptively peaceful village of St. Mary Mead, where roses climb the garden walls, the kettle is always on, and murder, it seems, is never very far away. Today's story is called The Secret Hidden in the Old Vicarage. A man is dead, a powerful man, the kind of man who knew too much about too many people and was never shy about using that knowledge to his own advantage. Gerald Fowler, magistrate, pillar of the community, and quite possibly the most despised person in the whole of the village, has been found murdered in the vicar's own study. Stabbed. Quietly. Efficiently. And with what appears to be very little remorse. The police have their theories. The village has its whispers, and half the congregation, it seems, had every reason in the world to want Gerald Fowler gone. But somewhere beneath the surface of this respectable little village, beneath the Sunday sermons and the flower arrangements and the polite nods exchanged after church, lies a secret. Old, buried, and desperately dangerous. A secret that someone was willing to kill to keep hidden. And there is one person in St. Mary Mead who notices things that others do not. One person who sits quietly by her window, knits her wool, and watches. Who understands, perhaps better than anyone, that human nature, in a village or in a city, is very much the same. Miss Jane Marple. If you enjoy mysteries like this one, old-fashioned, slow-burning, and full of unexpected turns, do consider subscribing and hitting the bell. There is quite a lot more where this came from. Now then, shall we begin? A village too quiet. The village of St. Mary Mead had, over the years, developed a rather unfortunate reputation. Not for anything dramatic, mind you. Not for its architecture, which was pleasant enough in a modest English sort of way. Not for its church, which was old and draughty and beloved by everyone who attended it. And certainly not for its residents, who were, on the whole, perfectly ordinary people living perfectly ordinary lives. No. St. Mary Mead had developed its reputation entirely on account of its murders. It was, as Dr. Haydock once remarked at a dinner party, rather unwisely given the company, the sort of village where one simply ought not to be too disagreeable. The odds, he said, were not in your favor. People laughed, of course. People always laughed. And then, sooner or later, something happened that made the laughter stop rather abruptly. Gerald Fowler had laughed too. He would not be laughing now, but that is getting ahead of things. On the morning that concerns us, a grey and uninspiring Tuesday in late October, Gerald Fowler was still very much alive. Unpleasant, arrogant, and very much alive. He was a tall man, Gerald Fowler. Broad across the shoulders, with a thick neck and a way of looking at people that made them feel they had already done something wrong, and were simply waiting to be found out. He had served as local magistrate for 11 years, and in that time had managed to make enemies with a dedication that most men reserve for making friends. He owned the largest house on Clover Lane, a red brick Georgian affair that he kept in immaculate condition, as though the house itself were a reflection of his authority. The garden was trimmed to military precision. The curtains were always straight. Even the door knocker, a heavy brass lion's head, seemed to wear an expression of faint disapproval. His housekeeper, Mrs. Rudge, had worked for him for 6 years and had never once, in all that time, been paid on time. She had mentioned this to her sister on more than one occasion. His clerk, a timid young man named Poole, had twice been publicly humiliated by Fowler in the courtroom. Once for a minor clerical error, and once, more cruelly, for stammering when asked a simple question. Poole had said nothing both times. He had simply gone home, sat in his small kitchen, and stared at the wall. The Reverend Leonard Clement, vicar of St. Mary Mead, had his own history with Gerald Fowler. It was not a history he discussed openly, but those who knew the vicar well, and Miss Marple knew him rather well indeed, could always tell when Fowler's name came up in conversation. there was a particular stillness that came over Reverend Clement. A careful, deliberate stillness, like a man choosing his words with great precision so as not to say the ones he actually meant. And then there was Eleanor Clement, the vicar's wife. She was a gentle woman, soft-spoken, gracious, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday and always had something kind to say, even about people who perhaps did not entirely deserve it. She ran the church flower rota with quiet efficiency and taught the younger Sunday school children with genuine warmth. Everyone in St. Mary Mead was fond of Eleanor Clement. Now, Gerald Fowler had not been fond of Eleanor Clement. Or rather, and this is perhaps more accurate, he had been fond of something she possessed, something she would very much have preferred he did not know about. What that something was, nobody in the village could quite say, but those who paid attention, and there were always those who paid attention in St. Mary Mead, had noticed that Eleanor grew pale and rigid whenever Fowler came near, that she never met his eyes, that she always found a reason to leave whatever room he entered. Miss Marple had noticed. Miss Jane Marple lived in a small house at the edge of the village, surrounded by a garden that was, in late October, looking rather tired and windswept. The roses had long finished. The dahlias were gone. What remained were the sturdy, sensible plants, the ones that did not make a fuss about the cold, rather like Miss Marple herself. She was in the garden on that grey Tuesday morning, doing very little of any practical consequence. She had been meaning to cut back the dead wood along the far wall for the better part of a week, but somehow the secateurs remained in her hand, unused, and her gaze kept drifting, as it so often did, toward the lane beyond the garden gate. She had seen Gerald Fowler walk past at 9:30. He was wearing his good overcoat, the dark wool one he reserved for official occasions, and he was walking with purpose in the direction of the Old Vicarage. That had struck her as slightly odd. Not the walking, of course. People walked, and the Old Vicarage was not an unreasonable destination for a Tuesday morning. Now, Reverend Clement was usually in his study between 9 and 12, working on his correspondence or preparing his Sunday sermon. He was a conscientious man, the vicar. Thorough, perhaps a little too earnest at times, but one could forgive a clergyman his earnestness. What struck Miss Marple as odd was the expression on Gerald Fowler's face. She had seen Fowler wear many expressions over the years. Contempt, most frequently. Impatience, that particular brand of satisfaction that some people wear when they have just made someone else feel very small indeed. But on this morning, walking past her garden gate with his collar turned up against the wind, Gerald Fowler had worn an expression she could only describe as anticipation. Not pleasant anticipation. Not the anticipation of a man going to meet a friend or collect good news. This the other kind. The kind that had a hard, bright edge to it. She watched him until he turned the corner and disappeared from sight. Then she looked down at the secateurs in her hand, thought for a moment, and went inside to put the kettle on. It was, she felt, going to be one of those days. She was not wrong. At 11:45, Mrs. Price from 2 doors down came hurrying along the lane with her coat half-buttoned and her face the particular shade of greyish-white that Miss Marple had learned over many years to associate with the discovery of something very unpleasant indeed. Miss Marple was at her front door before Mrs. Price had even reached the gate. "My dear," she said in a calm and steady voice. "Come inside. I'll make fresh tea." Mrs. Price came inside, and she sat down heavily in the armchair by the fire and pressed both hands flat against her knees as though trying to hold herself still. "It's Mr. Fowler," she said at last. "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. She set the kettle on. "I rather thought it might be." "He's dead," said Mrs. Price. "In the vicar's study, just sitting there in the chair. Dead." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the grey October garden, at the bare roses and the tired dahlias and the cold, flat sky above the lane. "Was Reverend Clement there?" she asked. "No," said Mrs. Price. "That's the thing. Nobody was there. The vicar had gone out at 11 to visit old Mr. Hartley. His wife was in the kitchen the whole morning. She says she never heard a sound. No, said Miss Marple softly, almost to herself. Oh, I don't suppose she did. She poured the tea. She set a cup in front of Mrs. Price, and then she untied her garden apron, folded it neatly over the back of a chair, and went to find her coat. There were things to be seen, and Miss Marple had always believed very firmly that things ought to be seen promptly before they were tidied away. The body in the study. The old vicarage stood at the far end of Church Lane, half hidden behind a row of elm trees that had, over the decades, grown tall and slightly overbearing. Much, some villagers privately thought, like the church itself. It was a solid, square-shouldered house, built in the previous century from pale stone that had darkened pleasantly with age. The garden was well kept but unpretentious. Window boxes, a gravel path, a wooden gate that needed painting and had needed painting for at least 3 years. Miss Marple had walked this path many times, for tea, for committee meetings, for the occasional quiet conversation with Eleanor Clement, who made excellent scones and was one of the few people in St. Mary Mead who could listen properly, who did not simply wait for her turn to speak. Today the gate was standing open. There were 2 constables outside the front door. A police motor car was parked badly on the verge, its front wheel entirely in the flower bed. Miss Marple noted this with mild disapproval and said nothing. One of the constables, a young man with a rather unfortunate haircut, stepped forward as she approached. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Nobody's allowed inside just now. Police orders." "Yes, of course," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Is Inspector Slack here?" The constable blinked. "You know the inspector?" "We are acquainted," said Miss Marple, in a tone that conveyed, without quite saying so, that the acquaintance had not always been entirely comfortable for both parties. The constable hesitated. He was very young, and there was something about this small, white-haired, mild-looking woman that made him uncertain. She had the manner of someone who was used to being let in. "I'll just go and check," he said, and disappeared inside. Miss Marple waited. She stood on the gravel path and looked at the house with her mild blue eyes and noticed several things. The study window on the ground floor to the left of the front door was closed. The curtains were 3/4 drawn, which was unusual for 11 in the morning. There was a faint scuff mark in the gravel near the side gate, the one that led around to the kitchen garden. And Eleanor Clement was standing at the drawing room window, looking out with an expression on her face that was not quite grief and not quite fear, but something that sat uncomfortably between the two. Their eyes met briefly. Eleanor looked away first. Inspector Slack appeared in the doorway. He was a compact, energetic man in his mid-40s, with a brisk manner and a mustache that always looked slightly too large for his face. He was, in Miss Marple's considered opinion, not a stupid man. He was, however, a man who had made a habit of reaching conclusions quickly and defending them stubbornly, which was, in its own way, a more dangerous quality than outright stupidity. He looked at Miss Marple with an expression that managed to combine professional wariness with something rather close to resignation. "Miss Marple," he said. "Inspector Slack," she replied. "How good of you to come so quickly." "It's my job," he said, somewhat unnecessarily. "Yes," she agreed. "Quite. Might I come in? This is a crime scene, Miss Marple. I can't just let members of the public wander about." "No, naturally not. I wouldn't dream of wandering. I thought perhaps I might simply look." Slack opened his mouth. He closed it again. He had been through variations of this conversation before, and he had a dim, uncomfortable memory that on at least 2 of those previous occasions, Miss Marple had noticed something that he had not. "5 minutes," he said, in a tone that suggested he was already regretting it. "And you touch nothing." "Of course," said Miss Marple, and stepped inside. The study was at the end of the hall, past the umbrella stand and a framed print of the sermon on the mount that had always struck Miss Marple as slightly too large for the space. The door was open. A young detective constable stood just inside, holding a notebook and looking as though he would rather be somewhere else entirely. Gerald Fowler was in the leather armchair beside the fireplace. He was seated, which gave the impression, at first glance, of a man who had simply fallen asleep. His head had fallen slightly to one side. His hands rested in his lap. His good dark overcoat was still on, slightly askew across his broad shoulders, as though he had sat down quickly without bothering to take it off. It was only when you looked more closely that the wrongness of it became apparent. The unnatural stillness, the particular grey-white quality of the skin, and the small, dark stain on the left side of his waistcoat, mostly hidden by the fold of his coat, that told the real story with quiet, brutal efficiency. Stabbed. Once, something thin and sharp. Dr. Haydick would say more later, but Miss Marple had seen enough to form a preliminary impression. So it had been quick. It had been close. And whoever had done it had known exactly what they were doing or had been extraordinarily fortunate, which in Miss Marple's experience amounted to much the same thing in terms of outcome. She stood in the doorway and looked. She did not go further into the room. She looked at Fowler. She looked at the desk. Papers neatly stacked, a pen lying at a slight angle, a glass of water untouched. She looked at the fireplace. Cold. No fire laid. She looked at the window, closed and latched from the inside. She looked at the carpet in front of the armchair. There were 2 sets of footprints visible in the slight compression of the pile. One was Fowler's, she assumed, leading from the door to the chair. The other was smaller, not a large foot, and the pattern suggested someone who had stood very close, closer than you would stand in ordinary conversation. She filed this away carefully. "Satisfied?" said Inspector Slack from behind her, in a tone that suggested he hoped very much that she was. "Not entirely," she said honestly, "but sufficiently for now. Tell me, where was Mrs. Clement when the body was found?" Slack consulted his notebook. "In the kitchen. She says she was there from 9 o'clock onwards. Baking. Didn't hear anything unusual. And the vicar? Out visiting a parishioner, old man named Hartley on Beacon Road. We've confirmed it. He left at 11, arrived at Hartley's by 1:15. Body was found at," he checked his notes, 11:50 by the vicar's young assistant, a Mr. Dennis Hawes, who came to drop off some papers. "Mr. Hawes," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "Yes. I don't know him very well. He's only been here, 4 months?" "5, said Slack. "And before you ask, yes, we'll be speaking to him." "I wasn't going to ask," said Miss Marple mildly. "I was simply thinking." Slack looked at her with the expression of a man who had learned at some cost to be slightly nervous when Miss Marple was simply thinking. She found Eleanor Clement in the drawing room. Eleanor was sitting very straight on the small sofa by the window, her hands folded in her lap, a cup of tea on the table beside her that had clearly been there long enough to go cold. She was a handsome woman in her early 50s with fair hair going softly grey and a face that was, in ordinary circumstances, composed and pleasant. At this moment it was neither. It was the face of someone holding themselves together by a considerable act of will. "Eleanor," said Miss Marple gently, sitting down in the chair across from her. "I'm so sorry. What a dreadful shock." Eleanor looked at her. Her eyes were dry, which Miss Marple noticed. Not from coldness. She did not think Eleanor Clement was a cold woman. But there was something in the dryness of those eyes, in the careful steadiness of her voice when she spoke, that gave Miss Marple a small, uncomfortable feeling somewhere in the region of her conscience. "It is dreadful," Eleanor said. "Yes, he was." She paused. "He was a difficult man." "He was," Miss Marple agreed. A silence settled between them. Outside in the lane, a car door slammed. One of the constables said something. A rook called from the elm trees and then fell quiet. "Will you be all right?" Miss Marple asked. "Is there someone who can come and be with you?" "My sister is coming from Exeter," Eleanor said. "She should be here by this evening." "Good," said Miss Marple. She rose, smoothed her coat, and picked up her bag. At the door she paused, as though something had just occurred to her. "Eleanor," she said, "the study fireplace. Was there usually a fire late in the morning?" Eleanor blinked. It was a very ordinary question, the kind of question that could have meant anything or nothing. "Leonard usually lights it himself," she said after a moment. "In the afternoons mostly. Not in the mornings." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "Yes, I see." She said goodbye and let herself out. Walking back along Church Lane, as with the elm trees moving overhead in the October wind and the cold settling properly into the afternoon, Miss Marple turned the morning over in her mind with the careful, methodical attention she gave to everything. Gerald Fowler had come to the vicarage that morning with that hard, bright look of anticipation on his face. He had gone into the study. He had not come out again. Someone had been in that room with him. Someone with a small foot who had stood very close. Someone who had, by 11:50, walked quietly out of the old vicarage, past Eleanor Clement's kitchen perhaps, or through the side gate where the gravel was scuffed, and left Gerald Fowler sitting in the leather armchair like a man who had simply fallen asleep. Miss Marple paused at the corner of the lane. She thought about Eleanor's face at the drawing-room window, and that expression that was not quite grief and not quite fear. She thought about the untouched cup of tea. She thought about the way Eleanor had said he was a difficult man, with that small, deliberate pause in the middle, like someone choosing a word with great care. Then she walked on home because it was nearly 1 o'clock and she had not yet had any lunch, and whatever else was happening in St. Mary Mead, one still had to eat. Half the village had a motive. Inspector Slack was, by nature, a man who liked lists. Not the decorative kind, not shopping lists or wish lists or the sort of meandering inventories that people made when they were trying to feel organized without actually doing anything. He liked investigative lists, neat, numbered, actionable. A list of suspects, a list of motives, a list of facts arranged in descending order of usefulness. By Wednesday morning, his list had 7 names on it. He did not write Miss Marple's name anywhere on his list. She was not a suspect. She was not, technically speaking, anything at all to do with this investigation. And yet her face kept appearing, unbidden, at the edge of his thinking. That mild, attentive expression, or those small blue eyes that looked at everything and gave nothing away. And he found it faintly irritating, in the way that a stone in one's shoe is faintly irritating. Small, persistent, impossible to ignore. The village of St. Mary Mead received the news of Gerald Fowler's death the way that villages receive all significant news, with a great deal of visible shock and a great deal of invisible relief. At the post office, Mrs. Weatherby mentioned to her assistant that she supposed there would be changes now on the parish council. Her tone was carefully neutral. Her expression was not. At the Blue Boar, 2 farmers who had appeared before Fowler's magistrate's court sat over their pints in a silence that had a particular quality of contentment to it. At the primary school, the headmistress, Miss Garnett, who had once been publicly accused by Fowler of financial mismanagement, an accusation entirely baseless but which had followed her for 2 uncomfortable years, heard the news, sat down at her desk, and ate a biscuit with what could only be described as quiet satisfaction. It was not, in short, a village in mourning. Miss Marple spent Wednesday morning doing what she did best, moving quietly through the village on perfectly ordinary errands while listening with great attention to everything said around her and a good deal of what was not. She had developed this habit over many years. People were far more revealing in the butcher's queue than in a police station. The pressure of official questioning made people careful. The ordinary texture of daily life made them careless in the best possible way. And by 11:30, she had collected the following. Gerald Fowler had 2 years previously ruled against a planning application by Mr. Edward Burrows, the local builder, in a manner several people considered irregular. Burrows had lost considerable money and had not forgotten it. A young woman named Clara Poole, sister of Fowler's unfortunate clerk, had apparently had some manner of altercation with Fowler the previous spring. Nobody knew the precise nature of it, but it had left her, according to Mrs. Weatherby, thoroughly shaken for the better part of a month. Dennis Hawes, the vicar's young assistant, the one who had found the body, had been seen arguing with Fowler outside the church hall 3 weeks ago, brief, low-voiced, but unmistakable in character. Hawes had been red in the face. Fowler had been smiling. The smile, so said Mrs. Price, had been the most unpleasant thing about the whole business. And there was, of course, Reverend Clement himself. Miss Marple thought about the vicar as she walked home. She had known Leonard Clement for 18 years. He was a good man, genuinely good, not merely respectable, patient with difficult parishioners, honest, sometimes to a fault. But there was that stillness that came over him when Fowler's name arose, that careful, deliberate quality, like a man walking across ice. She had never pressed him on it. Perhaps she should have. Inspector Slack conducted his interviews at the village hall. He began with Dennis Hawes. Hawes was a young man of perhaps 28, with an open, pleasant face currently doing its best to appear composed and not entirely succeeding. He had arrived at the vicarage at 11:45 to drop off correspondence. He had knocked. No answer. The front door was slightly ajar. He had gone to the study, found the door half open, and found Fowler in the chair. He had not touched anything. He had gone immediately to the telephone. Slack watched him carefully. Hawes told it clearly, without the over-precision that suggested rehearsal. Shaken, genuinely, but not in the way guilt produces shakiness. "You argued with Mr. Fowler," said Slack, 3 weeks ago, outside the church hall. Hawes's expression shifted. "We had words." "About what?" He had made a remark, an insinuation, about Reverend Clement. I found it offensive. "What sort of insinuation?" A pause. "I'd rather not say." "You may be asked to say, Mr. Hawes." "I understand," said Hawes quietly. "But I'd rather not, just now." Miss Marple, meanwhile, had called on Reverend Clement. She found him in the drawing room, looking considerably older than he had the previous Sunday. He was a spare, mild-featured man in his early 60s, with thin grey hair and a face that showed its feelings more honestly than was always convenient. At this moment, it showed exhaustion, distress, and something else. Something that Miss Marple examined carefully and could not quite name. "Leonard," she said, sitting down and accepting tea pressed upon her with the automatic hospitality of a man who didn't quite know what else to do. "How are you managing?" "Oh, tolerably," he said, which was clearly untrue. "Was Gerald Fowler in the habit of calling on you?" she asked after a moment. "Occasionally," he said. "Did you know he was coming on Tuesday?" A very slight pause. "No, I did not." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "He was wearing his good coat, as though he were coming on official business of some kind." The vicar said nothing, but his hand, resting on the arm of his chair, tightened very slightly. Miss Marple saw it. She did not remark on it. She finished her tea, admired the chrysanthemums, and took her leave. Walking home through the late afternoon, she thought about the tightening of that hand, about Hawes and his refusal to repeat an insinuation, about Eleanor's dry eyes and untouched tea. She thought she was beginning to see the shape of it. Not clearly yet. The outline was there, like a figure seen through frosted glass. The form recognizable, the details still obscured. She needed the details. That evening, Inspector Slack called on Miss Marple. He sat in her sitting room with a cup of tea he hadn't asked for, but was drinking anyway, and said, "I don't suppose you've noticed anything?" It was not quite a question. "One or two small things," said Miss Marple. "The footprint in the study carpet," she said. "Whoever stood beside that chair had a small foot. Not a man's foot, I should think." Slack's expression shifted fractionally. "We noticed that. And the side gate. The gravel was disturbed. Someone came or went that way. Not by the front path. We noticed that too, said Slack with slightly less certainty, and Mr. Hawes's reluctance to repeat the insinuation Fowler made about Reverend Clement. That seems to me rather important. Slack looked at her with the expression of a man recalculating something. Miss, what do you think the insinuation was? I don't know yet, she said honestly, but I intend to find out. Slack put down his teacup and stood. Miss Marple, he said at the door, you will keep me informed if you happen to notice anything further. Of course, Inspector, she said pleasantly. She watched him walk to his car, then closed the door and went to her writing desk and sat down and thought for a long time in the quiet of her sitting room, with the fire burning low and the wind moving in the garden outside. There was a secret somewhere in the Old Vicarage. She could feel it. The way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. Something old, something buried, something Gerald Fowler had known about and had brought with him on Tuesday morning in that hard, bright mood of anticipation. So she needed to find it before Inspector Slack did. Not for any competitive reason. Simply because she was very much afraid of what it might mean for someone she was rather fond of. Whispers. Behind closed doors. Thursday arrived with rain. Not the dramatic, stormy kind that at least has the decency to be interesting, but the grey, persistent, thoroughly English variety that settles in before breakfast and gives every indication of still being there at supper time. It turned the lane outside Miss Marple's window into a shallow river and gave the whole village the slightly defeated look of a watercolor left out in the weather. Miss Marple rather liked this sort of day. There was something clarifying about it. People stayed indoors. Conversations happened over tea rather than in passing on the high street, which meant they lasted longer and went deeper. And the particular quality of grey stillness that a rainy Thursday produced was, she had always found, rather conducive to thinking. And she had a great deal to think about. She had been up rather later than usual, sitting in her armchair with her knitting untouched in her lap, which was always a sign that something was occupying her mind with unusual seriousness. When even the knitting was abandoned, the matter was serious indeed. She made herself a sensible breakfast, ate it without tasting it, and went out into the rain. Eleanor Clement's sister, Margaret Holt, had arrived from Exeter the previous evening. She was a rather different sort of woman from Eleanor. Louder, more angular, with the brisk managing quality of someone who had spent a lifetime being competent in emergencies. She opened the vicarage door when Miss Marple knocked and looked at her with sharp, assessing eyes. Miss Marple, Eleanor mentioned you might call. I hope it isn't inconvenient, said Miss Marple. Come in out of the rain, said Margaret, which was not quite an answer, but served as one. Eleanor was in the sitting room. She looked better than she had on Tuesday. Less that terrible taut quality of someone holding themselves together by force. But still not well. There were shadows under her eyes and a careful stillness about her that Miss Marple read, with some unease, as the stillness of someone who had made a decision. The tea was produced. Margaret sat in the corner with some knitting of her own, with the slightly territorial air of an older sister who was not going to leave the room simply because a visitor had arrived. Miss Marple did not mind. I won't stay long, she said pleasantly. I simply wanted to see how you were getting on, and if you felt up to it, to ask you one or two small things. Eleanor looked at her with something that was both wariness and resignation, as though she had known this conversation was coming, and had been, in some complicated way, both dreading it and waiting for it. Of course, she said. What would you like to know? Miss Marple began with the obvious things. How was Leonard? Had the police been back? Was there anything practical that needed doing? Eleanor answered quietly and steadily. Then, in the way Miss Marple had perfected over many decades, she shifted the angle. Gerald Fowler, she said, in a tone of mild, almost idle curiosity. Had he been to the vicarage before? I wasn't sure whether it was a regular thing. A very brief hesitation. Not regularly, once or twice a year. His Leonard had parish business dealings with him. The church hall lease, various council matters. Of course, said Miss Marple. "And did he ever come when Leonard wasn't at home?" The silence this time was longer. In the corner, Margaret's knitting needles continued their steady rhythm. Outside, the rain tapped at the window with patient, indifferent persistence. "Once," said Eleanor at last spring, he called to leave some papers. Leonard was out. I told him to leave them with me." "Was that all?" Another pause. Eleanor looked down at her hands, pressed flat against her knees, exactly as they had been on Tuesday, that same gesture, as though she were trying to hold something in. "He spoke to me," Eleanor said carefully. "For a few minutes. He said something I found upsetting." "What sort of thing?" Miss Marple asked gently. Eleanor shook her head. "I'd rather not go into it. It was nothing that has any bearing on anything." Miss Marple did not press. She had learned over a long life that pressing was rarely as productive as waiting, and that the things people chose not to say were often more informative than the things they did. "Of course," she said. "I quite understand." She stayed another 20 minutes, talking about inconsequential things. When she left, Eleanor walked her to the door. On the step, with the rain falling steadily beyond the small porch roof, Eleanor said quietly and without preamble, "Miss Marple, you're trying to work out what happened." It was not a question. "I'm trying to understand it," Miss Marple said, which was slightly different. Eleanor looked at her. Those dry, careful eyes. That composed, exhausted face. "Gerald Fowler was a blackmailer," she said. Very quietly, very steadily. "I don't imagine that surprises you." "No," said Miss Marple honestly. "It does not. He knew things about people, and he used what he knew." She stopped. "That's all I can tell you." "Was he blackmailing you?" Miss Marple asked, with the same gentle directness she might have used asking about the weather. Eleanor's expression did not change, but something moved behind her eyes, a flicker of something that might have been relief, or might have been the opposite. "Goodbye, Miss Marple," she said. "Thank you for coming." She closed the door. Miss Marple stood on the vicarage step for a moment in the rain and thought. She had her answer, of a kind. The confirmation of the fact itself. Gerald Fowler had been blackmailing someone. Possibly several someones. And here, walking back along the rain-darkened lane, Miss Marple made her first mistake. It was an understandable mistake, the kind that comes not from carelessness, but from the natural human tendency to follow the most obvious thread. She had the footprint in the carpet. She had Eleanor's evasiveness. She had the side gate, the dry eyes, the hands pressed flat against the knees. And so she concluded, walking home through the rain, that Eleanor Clement was Gerald Fowler's victim. The person being blackmailed. The person with the most urgent reason to want him gone. It was a reasonable conclusion, the most reasonable conclusion on available evidence. But it was not quite the right one, or rather, not the complete one. She had identified one half of the truth and missed the other, and the half she missed was, as it turned out, the more important. But she did not know that yet. Inspector Slack telephoned at 4 o'clock. "We've had the pathologist's report," he said, without preamble. "Fowler died between 10 and 11:30 Tuesday morning. Single stab wound, left side just below the ribs. Something thin, a letter opener, possibly, or a long hat pin." A pause. "Required some knowledge of positioning. You'd need to know approximately where to aim." "Or be very lucky," said Miss Marple. "Or be very lucky," Slack conceded. "We're also looking into Fowler's financial affairs. There are irregularities." "Are there?" said Miss Marple, in a tone that conveyed no surprise whatsoever. "Payments. Regular. Going in, not out. 3 different accounts. We're trying to trace the sources." "I see," said Miss Marple. "That is useful information, Inspector." "Yes," said Slack. He paused, as when he spoke next, his voice had that reluctant quality of a man saying something he had not intended to say. "If you happen to hear anything about Fowler's private affairs, financial or otherwise. You'd let me know." "Immediately," said Miss Marple. She put the telephone down and sat for a moment in the quiet room. 3 separate payments, 3 accounts, which meant Fowler had not been blackmailing one person. He had been blackmailing at least 3. She picked up her knitting. For the first time in 2 days, her hands moved automatically, needles clicking their steady rhythm, while her mind worked quickly and quietly in the background. 3 victims. 1 killer. And this was the thought that made her pause mid-stitch. 3 victims. And the killer might be any one of them. Or none of them. Or someone else entirely who had known what Fowler was doing and had decided to stop it. She put the knitting down again. This was, she thought with a small sigh, becoming rather complicated. The secret in the letters. It was Miss Marple's friend, Mrs. Bantry, who provided the first real thread. She arrived at Miss Marple's door on Friday morning with a tin of shortbread and the particular bright-eyed energy of someone who has been sitting on a piece of news and can no longer contain it. "Jane," she said, settling herself into the armchair with the ease of long habit and accepting tea before it was offered. "I have been thinking about Eleanor Clement, and I've remembered something." "Have you?" said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I saw Eleanor. Years ago, before she came to St. Mary Mead, before she was Eleanor Clement." She paused to eat a piece of shortbread. She was Eleanor Ramsden then. Her husband was a man called Philip Ramsden, a solicitor. This must have been 15, 16 years ago, out in Longbridge. "Was he?" said Miss Marple. "He wasn't a very nice man. My cousin said there were rumors, financial things. He was handling estates, and there were questions about whether everything was entirely above board." Another piece of shortbread, with the slightly guilty air of someone who has promised to cut down. "He died. Rather suddenly. Heart, they said. But there were people who wondered. My cousin said the whole business was hushed up rather quickly. Eleanor left Longbridge shortly afterwards." Miss Marple set down her teacup very carefully. "Was there an inquest?" "I believe there was. Inconclusive, my cousin said." Mrs. Bantry looked at Miss Marple with sudden alarmed attention. "Jane, is this important?" "I don't know yet," said Miss Marple honestly. "But it is interesting." After Mrs. Bantry had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long time at her writing desk. Philip Ramsden, a solicitor, financial irregularities, a sudden death and an inconclusive inquest, a widow who left town quietly and arrived some time later in St. Mary Mead as the wife of a country vicar, and Gerald Fowler, magistrate for 23 years, former junior barrister in the county courts, who had, in the course of that career, encountered any number of inquests and financial investigations, who had possibly encountered the inquest into the death of Philip Ramsden of Longbridge. She wrote a letter to a retired solicitor in the county town, Mr. Pethwick, who had an excellent memory and owed her a small favor. She asked, in her pleasantly roundabout way, whether he recalled a Philip Ramsden of Longbridge and the circumstances of his death. She sealed it, walked it to the post office herself, and came home to consider what else needed doing. The letters were Dennis Hawes's idea. He arrived on Friday afternoon with the tentative air of a young man who has been thinking about something for 2 days and has finally decided to act. He sat turning his hat in his hands and said without preamble, "Miss Marple, I think I need to tell someone what I know. I wasn't sure whether to go to Inspector Slack, but I think you should know first." Miss Marple said nothing. She had found that saying nothing was considerably more effective than saying something. "The insinuation Fowler made about Reverend Clement," Hawes said. "He said that the vicar had married a woman with blood on her hands. Those were his exact words." His jaw tightened. He said it as though it were funny. "And what did you understand him to mean?" "At the time I thought it was simply cruelty. But after Tuesday I started to think more carefully." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. He put it on the table between them. I found this in the church office. It had fallen behind the radiator. Addressed to Reverend Clement, but it hadn't been opened. I think it fell before it was ever collected. Miss Marple looked at the envelope without touching it. Plain white, slightly dusty. The address typed. The postmark smudged but readable. 10 days ago. "Have you opened it?" she asked. "No, it felt wrong. But I thought..." "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "I think you were right to bring it." She did not open it immediately, so she sat with it on the table and thought about what she was about to do and whether it was right. She thought about this for perhaps 4 minutes. Then she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, like the envelope, on a machine with a slightly worn letter E. No salutation, no signature. "You should ask your wife about Philip Ramsden of Longbridge. Ask her what really happened the night he died. Ask her what she told the coroner and what she did not tell the coroner. You should ask her these things before someone else asks them for you. Someone who is less interested in your welfare than I am." Miss Marple read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and sat back. It was not from Fowler. The tone was wrong. Fowler's style was direct, contemptuous, confident. This was cautious. It's the tone of someone warning rather than threatening. Someone who knew what Fowler knew and was trying to give the vicar a chance to prepare, which meant someone else knew. She sat very still, feeling the shape of the thing shifting beneath her hands, like a puzzle that had looked one way and now turned slightly, looked entirely different. Philip Ramsden, blood on her hands. What she told the coroner and what she did not. If Eleanor had concealed something at the inquest, not necessarily criminal, but something, and Fowler had known about it, had perhaps been involved in the proceedings as a young barrister, then the blackmail was not about money. It was about a death. She telephoned Inspector Slack that evening. "I have some information," she said, "relating to Gerald Fowler's activities. I think it may be relevant to motive." Slack arrived within 20 minutes, which told her his own inquiries were not going well. She told him about Philip Ramsden. She told him about the letter and showed it to him. He read it standing up with the focused expression of a man recalibrating. "Blood on her hands," he said slowly. "That was Mr. Hawes's account of what Fowler said. Yes. You think Eleanor Clement killed her first husband?" "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that Gerald Fowler believed so, or at least that he had information suggesting something had been concealed at the inquest. Whether that constitutes guilt is quite another matter." Slack looked at the letter again. "Who sent this?" "Someone who also knew. Someone trying to help rather than threaten. Could be Fowler himself. Some kind of game." "No," said Miss Marple, with more certainty than she usually permitted herself. "The tone is entirely wrong. Fowler would not have warned anyone of anything. It was not in his nature." "We'll look into the Ramsden inquest," said Slack. "I'll make inquiries with Longbridge Constabulary." After he had gone, she sat for a while longer, the fire burning lower, the evening fully dark outside. She thought about Eleanor and Philip Ramsden, and a night in Longbridge 15 years ago about which something had been concealed. And she thought, uncomfortably, about her own conclusion of 2 days ago. That Eleanor was simply the victim, the one being blackmailed. She had been right about some of it. But somewhere in the gap between what she knew and what she thought she knew, something important was hiding, or like a dropped stitch in an otherwise tidy piece of knitting. Small, easy to miss, but once noticed, impossible to ignore. The kind of thing that if left unattended would eventually unravel everything above it. She picked up her knitting and looked at it properly for the first time in days, and there, 3 rows back, half hidden in the pattern, she saw it. She had dropped a stitch. She put the needles down. Not the knitting. Something else. Something in her thinking. She had assumed Eleanor had killed Fowler to silence him, but Eleanor had been in the kitchen all morning. Confirmed. And the footprint. Not a large foot. Not Eleanor's foot. Eleanor was a tall woman. Her feet were proportionate. Whose foot, then? Miss Marple sat very still in her chair. Whose foot? The Unravelling. Saturday morning arrived clear and cold. The rain had gone in the night, leaving everything washed and sharp-edged, the way the world sometimes looks after a long unpleasantness has finally passed. The sky was a pale, hard blue. The elm trees along Church Lane stood very still in the cold air, their last few leaves hanging on with the stubborn tenacity of things that know they are about to let go. Miss Marple was in her garden at 7:30. She was not gardening. She was standing at the far wall with her secateurs in her hand, in exactly the position she had been standing on Tuesday morning when she had watched Gerald Fowler walk past with that hard, bright look of anticipation on his face. She had not, she realized, come out here to garden. She had come out here to stand where she had been standing and think about what she had seen and what she had not seen and what the difference between those two things might mean. The dropped stitch had kept her awake. Not the knitting. She had found the dropped stitch in the knitting easily enough. Had corrected it in 10 minutes before bed. It was the other one. The one in her thinking. The one she had felt the presence of but could not quite locate. Whose foot? She had turned this over through the small hours with the dogged, slightly exhausted persistence of someone who knows the answer is there and cannot understand why it will not come. The footprint in the carpet. Small. Not Eleanor's. Not a large man's. She thought about everyone she had considered. Eleanor, too tall. Edward Burrows, large, weather-beaten, in boots that would leave unmistakable impressions. Reverend Clement, slight, yes, but his alibi was confirmed. Dennis Hawes. She thought about Hawes. Young, not large. His feet, she tried to recall. She had noticed his shoes when he sat in her parlor, turning his hat in his hands. Brown shoes, moderately sized. Not small, not the impression she had seen. Clara Poole. She had not thought enough about Clara Poole. She put the secateurs down on the wall and went inside. Clara Poole lived in a small terraced house on Mill Street, 2 roads back from the High Street with her brother Edmund, Fowler's unfortunate clerk, and their elderly mother, who was partially deaf and entirely formidable. Miss Marple had visited the house once, some years ago, on a matter connected with the church jumble sale. She remembered it as a neat, though slightly cramped house with good curtains and a scrubbed front step, the house of people who took quiet pride in small dignities. She arrived at 9 o'clock, which was, she acknowledged to herself, perhaps slightly early for a Saturday. But the thing that had kept her awake all night had acquired, in the clear cold morning, a particular urgency that overrode her usual consideration for other people's breakfast habits. Clara answered the door. She was a young woman of perhaps 25, slight and fair, with her brother's nervous quality but wearing it differently. Where Edmund Poole's nervousness expressed itself in diffidence and silence, Clara's came out as a kind of watchful alertness, as though she were perpetually braced for something. She had small hands, small feet, Miss Marple noted, in neat brown shoes, as she looked at Miss Marple with those watchful eyes, and said nothing. "Miss Poole," said Miss Marple pleasantly, "I'm so sorry to call so early. I wonder if I might come in for just a few minutes." Clara looked at her for a moment longer. Then she stood back and opened the door. They sat in the small front parlor, which smelled of furniture polish and toast. Mrs. Poole Sr. could be heard moving about somewhere at the back of the house. Edmund, Clara said, was at work. Saturday morning, the solicitor's office was open until noon. "What is it you want?" Clara asked. She was not rude exactly, but she had dispensed with the social preamble with a directness that told Miss Marple she had been expecting something of this kind. "I want to talk about Gerald Fowler," said Miss Marple simply. Clara's face did not change. "I've already spoken to the police." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I know. I'm not the police, as you're aware. I'm simply—" She paused, choosing her words with care. Someone who is trying to understand what happened. And I think you may be able to help me." "Why would I be able to help you?" "Because," said Miss Marple gently, "I think you knew more about Gerald Fowler's private activities than most people in this village, and I think you have been carrying that knowledge for some time and finding it rather heavy." A long silence. Outside, a cart horse went slowly past on Mill Street, its hooves loud in the cold quiet. Mrs. Poole called something from the back of the house. Clara did not answer. "He was blackmailing my brother," she said at last. Very flatly, very quietly, as though she were reporting a fact about the weather. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I thought he might be." Clara looked at her sharply. "You knew?" "I suspected. What did Fowler have on Edmund?" Clara's hands in her lap pressed together. "There was money. From the solicitor's accounts. Edmund, he didn't steal it, not exactly. He borrowed it, he said. He intended to put it back. He was in debt, gambling years ago. He was very young and very foolish, and he has been different ever since. He is not that person anymore." Her voice had taken on a fierce, almost fierce quality. "But Fowler found out. Somehow. He always found out, and he held it over Edmund for 3 years. And the payments," said Miss Marple. "In Fowler's accounts. One of the 3 regular payments." Clara nodded. A short, tight movement. "Edmund gave him money every month. From his salary. It left him almost nothing. The mother doesn't know. She can't know." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. She looked at Clara Poole, the watchful eyes, the pressed-together hands, the quality of someone who had been angry for a long time and had learned to keep the anger very still. "Miss Poole," she said, "I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me directly because I think you are a person who is capable of that, and because I think the truth at this point is considerably safer than anything else." Clara looked at her. "Waiting. Were you at the Old Vicarage on Tuesday morning?" The silence stretched. Outside, the cart horse had gone. The street was very quiet. "Yes," said Clara Poole. "I was." She had gone, she said, to speak to Fowler directly. She had found out the previous week that Fowler was intending to increase the payments. Edmund had come home on Monday evening looking like a man who had been told something devastating and had sat at the kitchen table and would not speak, and Clara had sat opposite him and waited, and finally it had come out. Fowler wanted double. He had said that Edmund's position was increasingly comfortable, and he felt the arrangement ought to reflect this. He had said it pleasantly, Clara reported, with the tone of a man discussing a business matter over lunch. Clara had not slept that night. On Tuesday morning, she had followed Fowler to the vicarage. She had seen him go in. She had waited outside at the side of the house, by the kitchen garden gate, for perhaps 10 minutes, trying to decide whether to go in and confront him or go home. She had decided, finally, to go in. She had gone through the side gate, so she had knocked at the study window which looked out onto the side path. There had been no answer. She had tried the side door. It was unlocked. She had gone in and along the passage to the study. She had found Fowler in the chair, already dead. "I knew immediately," she said. Her voice was steady, but it had the steadiness of someone who has rehearsed saying a thing many times in their head. "I didn't touch him. I didn't touch anything. I just stood there for a moment, and then I left." "By the side gate," Miss Marple said. "Yes." "And you told no one?" "No. Not even the police." Clara looked at her. "I had been there, in the room, after—" She stopped. "What would you have done?" Miss Marple considered this with genuine honesty. "I don't know," she said. "Perhaps the same. But Miss Poole, you understand that you must tell Inspector Slack this now. Today." Clara said nothing. "You were not the only person who could have gone in through that side door," Miss Marple said quietly. "You are not the only person who knew about Fowler's methods. You are not the only person he was threatening. But if you continue to say nothing, and the inspector finds out you were there, And he will find out because these things do come out. They always come out. It will look considerably worse for you than if you tell him yourself." Clara stared at the carpet for a long moment. "All right," she said at last. "I'll telephone him this morning." "Good," said Miss Marple. She rose, straightened her coat, picked up her bag. At the door she paused. "Miss Poole, the footprint in the study carpet. Did you go as far as the chair?" Clara looked up. "What?" "The footprint, in the carpet in front of the armchair. A small foot, standing very close." Clara shook her head. "I stood in the doorway. I didn't go into the room. I couldn't—" She stopped. "I couldn't go any closer." Miss Marple stood very still. If Clara had not crossed the room, if Clara had stood only in the doorway, then the footprint was not Clara's. She walked back along Mill Street and turned onto the High Street and stood for a moment outside the post office without going in, which confused the postmistress, who could see her through the window. Not Clara, not Eleanor. Too tall, wrong size. Not Burroughs. Wrong entirely. She went back through what she knew. The side door unlocked, the study door half open when Hawes arrived, and the glass of water on the desk, untouched. The cold fireplace. Leonard Clement lit the fire himself, Eleanor had said. In the afternoons mostly, not in the mornings. But it was October. The study was cold, and yet Fowler had come in his good coat and sat down without taking it off. Not because he was keeping it on to go shortly, but because the room was cold and he had not troubled to remove it because he had expected to be there for a short time only. He had been expecting to meet someone, not to wait for them, to meet them. Someone who had already agreed to come. Miss Marple started walking again, more quickly now. Who had agreed to meet Fowler on Tuesday morning in the vicar's study? Not Eleanor. She was in the kitchen, and her presence there was confirmed. Not Reverend Clement. He had gone out to visit Mr. Hartley, and his visit there was confirmed. Not Clara. She had followed Fowler, not been invited. Who else had access to the vicarage? Who else moved through that house with ease, with familiarity, without needing to knock? She was nearly at the vicarage gate before the thing she had been missing arrived, fully formed and perfectly clear, in the front of her mind. She stopped walking. Dennis Hawes, who had been at the vicarage 5 days a week for 5 months, who had keys to the church office and to the vicarage side door, who had argued with Fowler outside the church hall 3 weeks ago, had been red-faced, had been shaken, and had refused to tell Slack what the argument was about, who had found the body and had telephoned the police immediately, with the quick composure of someone who knew exactly what to do. Now, who had brought her the anonymous letter? She stood at the vicarage gate and thought about the anonymous letter, the cautious, careful tone of it, the worn letter E on the typewriter. She thought about the typewriter in the church office, which she had seen on her previous visits. An old imperial, slightly battered. She thought about Hawes sitting in her parlor with his hat in his hands, and those expressive hands that moved when he talked. She thought about what he had said. He made an insinuation about Reverend Clement. I found it offensive. Not about Eleanor. About Reverend Clement. And she thought, and this was the thing she had been missing, the dropped stitch, sort of the thing that had kept her awake. She thought about why a young man who had been in the village only 5 months would find an insinuation about the vicar's wife offensive enough to argue about in the street with a magistrate. Unless the young man knew something. Unless the young man had a reason, a personal, private, specific reason, to care very much about Eleanor Clement and whatever secret Gerald Fowler was holding over her. Miss Marple opened the vicarage gate. She did not go to the front door. She went instead to the church office, which was in a small outbuilding at the side of the vicarage garden, connected to the main house by a covered walkway. The door was unlocked. Hawes was inside, sitting at the desk with a pile of parish correspondence in front of him, which he was clearly not reading. He looked up when she came in. Now something moved in his face. A quick, almost involuntary expression, gone before it could be named. Then the composure came back, and he said, "Miss Marple, good morning," in a perfectly even voice. She sat down in the chair across the desk from him. The typewriter was on the side table, Old Imperial. She could see, even from where she sat, that the letter E sat slightly lower than the others. "Mr. Hawes," she said, "I think it is time we talked properly." He looked at her for a moment. Then he put down the letter he was not reading and folded his hands on the desk. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think perhaps it is." His name, he told her, was not Dennis Hawes. That is to say, it was Dennis Hawes. It was the name he had been given by his adoptive family, the family that had raised him from the age of 3 in a small town in Wiltshire. But it was not the name he had been born with. He had been born Dennis Ramsden, Eleanor Ramsden's son. Miss Marple sat with this for a moment. She had thought she was prepared for a surprise. She found, mildly, that she was not quite as prepared as she had imagined. "She doesn't know," Hawes said before she could speak. "Eleanor, Mrs. Clement, she doesn't know who I am. I haven't told her. I came here to—" He stopped, started again, more carefully. "I came here because I found out, 2 years ago, that my mother was alive, that she hadn't died as I'd always been told. I found out where she was, and I didn't want to disrupt her life. I just wanted to see her, to know she was all right." "But then you found out about Fowler," Miss Marple said. "Not immediately. It took me a few months to understand what was happening. The way she went pale when his name came up. The way she'd leave a room when he arrived. I started watching, and then I found the payments Edmund Poole mentioned, without knowing what he was saying, that there were regular payments going to Fowler from several sources. I started to understand. And the insinuation outside the church hall," said Miss Marple. "About Reverend Clement. What was it exactly?" Hawes's jaw tightened. He said that if the vicar knew what his wife had done to her first husband, he'd have her out of the vicarage by Sunday. He said it as a joke. He was walking past. He barely even stopped. He just said it and walked on. A pause. I couldn't let it go. "No," said Miss Marple gently. "I don't imagine you could." A silence settled. Outside, a thrush was singing in the garden with the unseasonal cheerfulness that thrushes occasionally produced in October, as though they had simply decided not to acknowledge the cold. "Mr. Hawes," said Miss Marple, "I need to ask you directly. Did you go into that study on Tuesday morning before you telephoned the police?" He met her eyes. "Yes. And the footprint in the carpet, I went to him. I don't know why. I think I wanted to make certain he was really—" He stopped. "I didn't touch him. I just stood there for a moment, and then I stepped back and went to the telephone." Miss Marple looked at him. He was telling the truth. She was fairly certain of this, not because people always told the truth, but because she had, over many years, had developed a reasonably reliable instinct for the particular quality of honesty that looked like courage. The kind that came not from having nothing to hide, but from having decided, at some cost, not to hide it. "There is something else," she said. "Isn't there?" Not a question. Hawes looked at his hands for a moment. "Yes," he said. He reached into the desk drawer and produced a small key, the kind that opens a correspondence box or a personal strongbox. He put it on the desk between them. "I found this," he said, "in Fowler's coat pocket when I stood beside him. I took it. I know I shouldn't have. I told myself it was because I didn't know what it would open, and I was afraid it might be something that would hurt Eleanor. Hurt my—" He stopped. "Her." Miss Marple looked at the key. "Do you know what it opens?" "I think so. Fowler kept a strongbox at the solicitor's office on Crane Street. Everyone knew about it. He made no secret of it. He thought it made him seem important. Poole mentioned it once. Have you used it?" "No." He looked at her directly. "I brought it to you instead." Inspector Slack arrived at the vicarage at 11 o'clock, summoned by a telephone call from Miss Marple that had been brief, firm, and characteristically uninformative about its actual purpose. He found Miss Marple and Dennis Hawes in the church office. He found the key on the desk between them. He found, in the course of the next 20 minutes, rather more than he had expected. Miss Marple told him about Hawes's identity. Hawes confirmed it. Miss Marple told him about the key. Hawes confirmed that too. She told him about Clara Poole, and who had in fact already telephoned Slack that morning as promised. This gave Slack a slightly peculiar expression, the expression of a man receiving confirmation of something he had not expected to have confirmed. The footprint in the study, Miss Marple said when she had laid out the main lines, was Mr. Hawes's. He entered the room before telephoning. He should have said so at once, and he understands that. But he was not the one who made that wound. Slack looked at Hawes. You're certain you found him already dead? Completely certain, said Hawes. And the key should be used, said Miss Marple, to open the strongbox on Crane Street. I suspect it will contain documentation relevant to at least 3 cases of blackmail. Possibly more. Slack picked up the key. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man who is recalculating, fairly substantially, the direction of his investigation. Right, he said. I'll need a full statement from you, Mr. Hawes. And from Miss Poole. He paused. And then I suppose I'll need to look at what's in that box. He looked at Miss Marple. There was something in his expression, not quite gratitude and certainly not deference, but something in the region of professional acknowledgement, which from Slack was considerable. I don't suppose, he said with careful lack of enthusiasm, you'd like to be present when we open it. I thought you'd never ask, said Miss Marple pleasantly. The strongbox was opened at 2 o'clock that afternoon, in the solicitor's office on Crane Street, in the presence of Inspector Slack, his sergeant, and the solicitor himself, a worried-looking man named Grimes, who kept saying extraordinary, quite extraordinary, and Miss Marple, who sat quietly in the corner and said nothing. Inside were 3 envelopes, each one labeled in Fowler's precise, controlled handwriting. The first contained documents relating to Edmund Poole, a written confession signed about the borrowed money, along with a letter from Fowler setting out the payment arrangement. Neat, thorough, utterly without mercy. The second contained a sheaf of papers relating to Edward Burrows. Not the planning matter, as it turned out, but something older. A matter of insurance fraud 15 years back, minor but documentable. Fowler had clearly been saving it. The third envelope Miss Marple looked at for a long moment before Slack opened it. It was labeled simply Ramsden, and inside was a coroner's report, or rather, a partial coroner's report, 3 pages, clearly removed from an official record. Alongside it, a handwritten statement, not signed, describing in careful, factual language the events of the night Philip Ramsden died. According to the statement, Ramsden had not died of a simple heart attack. He had been given, in his evening whiskey, a quantity of a sedative compound, enough to slow his heart considerably in a man already prone to cardiac irregularity, not enough to be easily detected in a standard post-mortem of the era. The statement did not say who had given it to him, but it described who had been in the house that night. Eleanor, only Eleanor. Slack read it twice. Then he looked up at Miss Marple. She was looking at the document with an expression he could not easily read, not shock. She had clearly prepared herself for something of this kind. Not satisfaction, certainly. Something quieter and more complicated than either. Is this... Slack began. It is what Fowler believed, Miss Marple said carefully. What he had assembled. Whether it constitutes proof? That is quite another matter, and well above my competence to say. She paused. But I think the more important question now is not whether it constitutes proof of what Eleanor did 15 years ago. The more important question is who killed Gerald Fowler on Tuesday morning in the vicar's study. Slack looked at her. And you know, he said, it was not quite a question. "I believe so," said Miss Marple quietly. "Yes, I believe I do." She had worked it out fully, she would say later. Not to Slack, who would not have appreciated the candor, but to Mrs. Bantry, who would, somewhere between the strong-box and the walk back to the vicarage. The last pieces had come together not with any dramatic revelation, but with the quiet, almost anticlimactic click of a thing falling into its proper place. Eleanor had been in the kitchen all morning, confirmed. Reverend Clement had been at Mr. Hartley's, confirmed. Clara Poole had entered through the side door and found Fowler already dead. Hawes had entered the study and found Fowler already dead. Which meant Fowler had been killed before Clara arrived. Which meant he had been killed between 10 o'clock, when he had been seen walking down Church Lane, and approximately 11:15, when Clara, having followed him and waited, had finally gone inside. In that window of time, Eleanor was in the kitchen. Clement was at Hartley's. But there was a third person who lived in that house. A third person who moved through it every day. A third person whose small feet walked those familiar floors without needing to knock or explain or account for their presence. A person who had known about the blackmail, who had seen Eleanor's suffering, that gradual, quiet, prolonged suffering, for months. Who had a reason, a deep and private and entirely personal reason, to want it stopped. Who had taken from the kitchen, not Eleanor's kitchen, but the vicarage kitchen, which he knew as well as his own, a long-handled implement of some kind, a skewer, perhaps, something thin and sharp. Who had gone to the study, who had opened the door, who had found Fowler sitting in the leather chair with that hard, bright look of anticipation on his face, who had stood close enough, and who had then gone to the telephone and called the police with the quick, composed efficiency of someone doing the next necessary thing. Dennis Hawes, who was not Dennis Hawes, Dennis Ramsden, Eleanor's son. She told Slack at the vicarage gate as he was getting into his motor car. She told him quietly, with no drama and no satisfaction, in the way that she told people difficult things. Directly, plainly, with the clear awareness that directness was a form of respect. Slack listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When she finished, he sat for a moment with his hand on the car door. "The implement," he said. "We didn't find anything." "No," said Miss Marple. "I don't imagine you did. He had 5 months to familiarize himself with the vicarage and its grounds. Well, he would have known where to dispose of it." Another silence. A rook called from the elm trees. The cold afternoon was going towards evening. "He came here for her," Slack said. Not incredulously, almost gently for Slack. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I think so. I think he came meaning only to watch over her. And then he found out what Fowler was doing to her. What Fowler had been doing for years. And he..." She stopped. "He's very young, and he had never had a mother. And sometimes those two things together produce a kind of feeling that is very difficult to govern." Slack looked at her. "You feel sorry for him," he said. Miss Marple considered this. "I feel sorry for all of them," she said honestly. "That is not the same as thinking what he did was right." Slack nodded. A brief, decisive movement. "Right," he said. "I'll bring him in." He got into the car. Miss Marple stood at the vicarage gate and watched the motor car move off down Church Lane and turn the corner and disappear. The elm trees stood very still in the cold air. The last few leaves hung on. She stood there for rather a long time. Justice and silence. The arrest of Dennis Hawes took place on Saturday evening. Miss Marple was not present for it. She had not wished to be. There are things that one sets in motion and then steps back from, not from cowardice and not from indifference, but from a clear-eyed understanding that one's presence would serve no useful purpose and might cause additional pain to people who had already sustained quite enough. She heard about it from Mrs. Bantry, who heard about it from Dr. Haydock, who had been called to the vicarage afterwards because Eleanor Clement had collapsed. Not dramatically, Not in the way that people collapse in novels, with a cry and a falling. She had simply, according to Dr. Haydock, sat down very carefully in the nearest chair when Slack told her, and had stayed there, quite still and quite silent, and for a very long time. Leonard Clement had stood beside her with his hand on her shoulder, and had not spoken either. Margaret Holt had made tea that nobody drank. Dr. Haydock had prescribed rest and said there was nothing medically wrong with Eleanor Clement that medicine could address. Miss Marple, hearing this, thought that Dr. Haydock was, as usual, entirely right. She did not sleep well on Saturday night. This was not unusual after a case had resolved. People sometimes assumed, people who did not know her well, that the solving of a thing brought a kind of satisfaction that made everything neat and complete. A puzzle finished, a picture whole. She had never found it so. The solving brought clarity. Yes, and clarity was necessary. But clarity and comfort were very different things, and she had long since stopped confusing them, because she lay in the dark and thought about Dennis Ramsden. 28 years old, raised by strangers in Wiltshire who had been kind enough, by all accounts, but had given him a name that was not his name and a history that was not his history. 2 years ago, he had found out the truth, that his mother had not died, as he had been told, but was alive and living quietly in an English village, married to a country vicar, tending the church flower rota and teaching Sunday school children. He had come to find her. He had not announced himself. He had simply come and watched and, in his own complicated, guarded way, begun to love her. And then he had discovered what Gerald Fowler was doing to her. Miss Marple turned this over in the dark with the honesty that she always brought to difficult things. She did not flinch from the arithmetic of it, and Fowler had been blackmailing Eleanor for how long? She did not know precisely, but the payments in his accounts were at least 3 years old. 3 years of monthly fear. 3 years of that careful, contained suffering that Miss Marple had seen in Eleanor's face without fully understanding it. 3 years of dry eyes and untouched tea, and hands pressed flat against the knees, and Dennis Hawes, Dennis Ramsden, had watched it for 5 months and had finally, on a grey Tuesday morning in October, done something about it. Was it right? No, she did not think it was right. She had never thought that killing was right, even when the person killed was a blackmailer with the moral sensibility of a stone, even when the person who killed had reasons that were, she searched for the honest word, understandable. And understanding was not the same as justifying. She had learned that a long time ago, and she had not unlearned it. But she lay in the dark and she thought about a young man who had never had a mother, finding one at last, and watching someone destroy her, and she could not feel, the clean, uncomplicated moral certainty that she supposed she ought to feel. She felt instead the complicated, slightly exhausted sadness of someone who has seen too much of human nature to be surprised by it and too much of human suffering to be unmoved by it. She got up at 6 and made tea and sat at her kitchen window and watched the dawn come up over the garden, pale and cold and very quiet. Inspector Slack came on Sunday afternoon. He came without telephoning first, which was unusual, and then he accepted tea without the usual performance of mild reluctance, which was more unusual still. He sat in the armchair by the fire and looked at the flames for a moment before speaking. "Hawes has made a full statement," he said. Miss Marple waited. He went to the study at approximately 10:10. He says Fowler was expecting him. He had sent a note to the church office 2 days before, asking Hawes to come to the vicarage on Tuesday morning to witness some papers. Official business. Hawes thinks now it was a pretext, that Fowler had found out who he was and wanted to have him present for whatever he was planning to say to Eleanor. Found out who he was, Miss Marple repeated. Had Fowler known about the connection to Eleanor? Not at first, apparently. But Fowler was thorough, and he had connections in Longbridge, old colleagues from his barrister days. Hawes thinks Fowler had been making enquiries for several weeks, had traced the adoption, traced the name change. Slack paused. He says Fowler greeted him by name when he came in. His real name, Ramsden. He said it the way he said things. That manner of his, enjoying the effect. Miss Marple looked at the fire. And then? Fowler told him what he knew about Eleanor and Philip Ramsden, about what whores Ramsden was. He told him he intended to present Eleanor with a choice that morning. Either increase her payments substantially, or he would take what he had to the police. He said... Slack paused again, briefly. He said that having the woman's own son present for the conversation would be an interesting addition. The fire crackled. Outside, the Sunday bells of St. Mary Mead's church began, distant and clear in the cold air. He had a letter opener on the desk, Slack said. Fowler did. Long, thin, silver thing. Hawes took it up while Fowler was talking. He says he doesn't entirely remember deciding to do it. He just did it. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Does he show remorse? She asked at last. Slack considered this with the careful honesty that he brought when he chose to difficult questions. He shows something, he said. Whether it's remorse exactly. He stopped. He said one thing that I thought was... He seemed to search for the word, candid. He said he would do it again. A silence settled between them. The bells continued outside, measuring out the quiet Sunday morning. Somewhere down the lane, a dog barked twice and was still. So and Eleanor, Miss Marple asked. She knows everything now, said Slack. Her son. What Fowler had, what Hawes, what Ramsden did. He looked at his tea. She hasn't made a statement yet about Philip Ramsden. Whether she will, whether there's anything prosecutable after 16 years, that's above my level. The documents from the strongbox have gone to the county. It'll be someone else's problem. It will be her problem, said Miss Marple quietly. Yes, said Slack. I imagine it will. She went to the vicarage on Monday. Margaret Holt opened the door and looked at her with the sharp, assessing eyes of a woman who had been managing a family emergency for 4 days and was beginning to show the edges of it. She's asking for you, Margaret said, without preamble. I wasn't going to let anyone in, but she specifically asked. Miss Marple was shown to the sitting room. Eleanor was in the chair by the window, the same chair she had been sitting in on Tuesday, with the same untouched quality to the air around her. But she was different. She was not holding herself together with that terrible, careful tension. She looked instead like someone from whom something had been taken away. Not a good thing, necessarily. Sometimes what is taken is necessary, even if it was also wrong. She looked smaller, and somehow, in a way that Miss Marple could not quite articulate, more real. She looked up when Miss Marple came in. Sit down, Jane, she said. It was the first time in their acquaintance that Eleanor had used her Christian name. Miss Marple sat. He came for me, Eleanor said. She said it simply, without drama, and as though she was still getting used to the idea. All this time, he came because he wanted to find me. Yes, said Miss Marple. He never said a word. Her voice was very even. 5 months. Not one word. No, said Miss Marple. He was afraid, I think, of disrupting your life. He wanted to be near you without being a complication. Eleanor looked at the window. The garden outside was pale and still, the last of October settling over it like a quiet hand. Philip, she said after a moment. She said the name as though testing its weight after a long time of not saying it. I suppose you know. Some of it, said Miss Marple. What was in Fowler's documents? Not the rest. Eleanor was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Miss Marple began to wonder if she was going to speak at all. He was not a good man, Eleanor said at last. Philip, he was not a good man, and I knew it, and I stayed because I was 23 and frightened, and I didn't know what else to do. A pause. He was stealing from his clients. Elderly people, mostly. People who trusted him with their estates, their savings. I knew about it. I said nothing because... She stopped. Because I was a coward. That is the honest answer. She looked at her hands. The night he died, he had come home in a state. Angry, frightened. Someone had found out, he said. It was going to come out. He drank. He drank a great deal. He took his sleeping drops. He always took too many when he was anxious. He never listened when the doctor told him to be careful. And I... Another long pause. I did not stop him. I told myself I simply didn't notice. But I noticed. Miss Marple sat very still. I did not give him anything, Eleanor said, with a quiet precision that felt important. The document Fowler had. Whoever wrote that statement was wrong or lying, or Fowler had embellished it. I gave Philip nothing, but I did not stop him. And when he was gone, I told the coroner it had been sudden. I didn't mention the drops. I didn't mention that I had seen him take them. She looked up. That is what I did. That is all of it. I've never told anyone that before. Miss Marple looked at her. Thank you for telling me, she said gently. Eleanor nodded. A small, exhausted movement. What will happen now? She asked. To Dennis. Miss Marple considered being less than honest. It took her approximately 2 seconds to discard this. I don't know precisely, she said. That will depend on a number of things. His age and his circumstances. The nature of the victim. She paused. The fact that Fowler was a blackmailer will be known. It will not excuse what was done, but it will be a context. He killed a man, Eleanor said. She said it with a directness that Miss Marple respected. Yes, said Miss Marple. He did. For me. For you, Miss Marple said. Yes. Eleanor looked at the window again, the pale October garden, the bare roses, the elm trees beyond the wall, very still in the cold air. I don't know what to do with that, she said quietly. No, said Miss Marple. I don't imagine you do. Not yet. She rose, smoothed her coat, picked up her bag. At the door she paused, as she so often did. Eleanor, he is your son. Whatever else is true, whatever happens next, that is also true. Eleanor did not answer, but something shifted in her face. Something small and complicated, and not entirely without hope. Miss Marple let herself out. She walked home along Church Lane in the cold Monday afternoon, with the elm trees moving overhead and the rooks calling, and the smell of autumn settling over everything like a clean, slightly melancholy cloth. She thought about what she had done. She thought about what it had cost. She thought about Eleanor Clement, who had carried a silent, corrosive guilt for 16 years, and was now going to have to carry a different kind. She thought about Dennis Ramsden, 28 years old, who had come looking for his mother and had found her and had destroyed himself in the process of trying to protect her. She thought about Leonard Clement, who had known nothing. She was fairly certain now that he had known nothing, and was going to have to learn it all at once. She thought about Edmund Poole, who might now, perhaps, be free of a burden that had bent him for 3 years. She thought about Clara, who had stood in a dead man's doorway and chosen, until the last moment, silence. She thought about Gerald Fowler, who had been a blackmailer and a bully and a man of profound and deliberate cruelty, and who was now dead, and for whose death she could not, try as she might, produce more than the most theoretical and dutiful sense of loss. She thought, and this was the thought that stayed with her, walking the last 100 yards to her own gate, about the fundamental, irresolvable problem at the heart of every murder she had ever encountered, which was not who had done it, or why, or even how. These things could be found out. These things could be laid out and examined and dealt with. The problem was what was left afterwards, what remained in a vicarage sitting room when the police had gone and the tea had gone cold. What a young man's face looked like when he said, "I would do it again." what 16 years of silence did to a person, and what the ending of that silence would do now. These things could not be solved. They could only be lived with. Miss Marple opened her garden gate, went inside, took off her coat and her good walking shoes, and put the kettle on. She sat down at her kitchen table and looked at her hands for a moment. Small, capable, slightly stiff in the cold, and thought that she was, in fact, quite tired. Not physically, the other kind. The kettle began to sing. She got up and made the tea, and stood at her kitchen window and looked out at the pale October garden, the bare roses, the tired dahlias, the cold, flat light. And she thought that tomorrow she really must see about cutting back the dead wood along the far wall. She had been putting it off for too long. There was a postscript of sorts. A letter arrived on Thursday from Mr. Pethwick, the retired solicitor, in response to the inquiry she had sent on Friday. He did, as it happened, recall the Ramsden inquest. He remembered it as an untidy business. Inconclusive, quickly closed, the widow departed shortly after. He had, he wrote, always thought there was more to it than had come out. He was glad someone was looking into it, though he was not sure, at this late stage, that much could be done. He was probably right, Miss Marple thought, folding the letter carefully. The county authorities had the documents from Fowler's strong box. Whether they would pursue a 16-year-old matter against a vicar's wife on the basis of a dead blackmailer's papers was, as Slack had said, someone else's problem. She suspected they would not. She suspected that Eleanor Clement would live out her days in St. Mary Mead with the quiet, careful dignity she had always maintained, carrying what she carried, and that most people would never know any of it. Justice, in Miss Marple's long experience, did not always look the way people expected it to look. Sometimes it was loud and formal and arrived in a courtroom. Sometimes it was a letter from a retired solicitor, read at a kitchen table on a Thursday morning that said simply, "I always thought there was more to it." And sometimes it was a young man in a police cell who had found his mother too late and loved her too much and would spend a long time now in a small room thinking about what that meant. She folded Mr. Pethwick's letter and put it in the drawer of her writing desk. Then she put on her coat and her garden gloves and went out with the secateurs to deal with the dead wood along the far wall. It was, after all, well past time.